Your first step to making your pinch pot is to get a ball of clay to be as round as possible. And the more symmetrical the ball of clay is, the more symmetrical your pinch pot will end up being. So you do have to be pretty forceful with it. It's a lot more of repetition than just brute force. You can use your hands to gently tap the form in, also rolling it on the canvas. Once it is as round as possible, you're going to take your thumb and insert into the ball of clay using the pad of your thumb, not your nail. And you want to stop with about 1/2 inch or so left in the bottom. From there, you're going to gently hold the clay in one hand and start pinching with your other hand. So pinch, turn, pinch, and turn. It's very much a methodical motion. And again, it's more repetition than force. So do your best not to pinch too hard and keep turning. Imagining there is a spiral staircase that your thumb and fingers are following. So starting at the bottom of the pinch pot and spiraling upwards. You also should be trying to not just use your fingertips, but using all of the inside of your fingers and again the pad of your thumb. So that's 2 rotations around. If your hand becomes fatigued, you can switch hands. Again, starting at the bottom. At this point, you are feeling for any thick areas and just focusing on those. Again, using that motion of pinching that I just showed. That will allow you to not have as many really thin areas and thick areas. The key here is consistency. You don't want it to be lumpy. You're going to have bumps in it because of the pinching, but you're just gradually thinning it out. If you are someone that works fast, you're going to have to really be careful with not moving too quickly because it will very easily start to get out of shape and lopsided if you move too fast. And keep looking at it from multiple viewpoints like I just did there, gently flipping it upside down, looking at it from eye level, above, below, all those angles. At this stage, you're also trying to keep it symmetrical. You do not want it to start becoming lopsided. Continuing to thin those walls out until you have about 1/2 inch or so of thickness. That would be the first work session of the day. Then gently sit it upside down to make any other adjustments if you need to. As the clay is exposed to air and you're handling it, you will notice that it will start to dry out a bit. And that is a good thing. It needs to start to dry, but you don't want it to get too dry. You can then start to do some basic smoothing just with your thumb and fingers. Long pulls with your thumb, starting from the interior and dragging upwards. You might see little cracks that are forming. Again, just try to keep up with those as best as possible. Smearing the clay around. Notice at all times you are holding the pinch pot. You are not sitting it on its bottom part because otherwise it will start to get flat. So this first stage, you're holding it. Now what I'm doing right now is getting a sponge and lightly dampening it. So you're going to wring out all the excess water. You do not want it soaking or dripping wet. Really squeeze the extra water out. This particular clay doesn't take much water before it starts to turn really mushy. But don't overdo it. You definitely can overdo it. Again, you're cradling that pinch pot in your hand and using your other hand to gently start to smooth the clay around with the dampened sponge. The most important thing, though, is to try to get things as smooth as possible just with your hands rather than resorting to the sponge. You can see just with that, it already is becoming a lot more plastic, a lot more floppy. So at this point, you would want to take a break, take the extra bag and create a little cushion for it, almost like a mold. Let it sit upside down on top of that bag. Gently nudge it into place. And that would be it for day 1 or work session 1. So with your second work session, you should notice that the clay has dried a little bit. Again, your bag should be over top of your project whenever you're not working with it. At this point, you're continuing to pinch and you want to check the consistency or the thickness. Ideally, it's a 1/4 inch thick, which would be the thickness of a pencil. So if you have a pencil nearby, you can use that as a tool to gauge the thickness. But past the rim, which is the top, you will have to feel with your fingers. All right, so at this point, I am using our version of a rib, which is a tool that we use to compress and smooth the clay. Match up the curve of that rib with the interior of the bowl. Now, if you need to sit it down, that is fine, but notice my left hand is supporting from the outside. You should never apply force on the wall of anything made out of clay when it's at this stage without supporting it from the other side. So I'm applying force on the inside, I'm scraping gently with that rib, holding on the outside. Notice the angle of the rib. It is not perpendicular. I'm holding it at more of a 45-degree angle, so I'm getting more surface area. And continuing to scrape and clean off the rib as I go. So that also will help with some shaping to get it to be more symmetrical, along with smoothing. Now, as you continue with this process, keep looking at it from multiple viewpoints. You are keeping an eye on any cracks that may be forming, because as this starts to get more dry, it's prone to have more cracks that form. If you're not being careful with how you're handling the pinch pot, you will see that it's getting pulled and torn and stretched open. So you do need to support it very, very gently. If the rim becomes uneven, you can gently flip it upside down and tap on your workspace, on your canvas. That will help level out the top. But again, normally if you're seeing cracks forming at this stage, it's probably because you're not handling the pinch pot carefully enough. You're moving the walls around, and that movement is causing tears to form. Cracks will also form at the thinnest spots. So if you have 1 or 2 spots in your clay wall along the rim that are especially thin, it's going to start to split apart because it's the weakest point in your pinch pot. So here again, I'm doing some smoothing using fingertips to smooth. Really, it's basically smearing the clay. You can get your sponge out again, but make sure it is not soaking wet. You wring out as much of that water as possible and continue to work around the surface, compressing and smoothing the walls of your clay. So here what I'm doing is I have some little cracks that are forming. I'm trying to rub those away. You catch these early, they're easier to fix. And again, make sure you're supporting with your other hand as you're doing this work. Try not to be too forceful or too rough with the pinch pot because it will want to crack back open. So this stage, the clay is still leather hard, meaning it's flexible, but it's starting to support the weight of the wall. It's keeping its shape, right? It's retaining that bowl shape. It's not flopping outwards, although it is still relatively soft. All right, so again, keep checking it out from all angles. You can gently tap that on the canvas and nudge that back into shape. And as you're doing that, check the symmetry. You can gently tap, almost like a paddling sort of motion, to tap your form back into shape. And that's what it should look like. You still have some fingerprint marks, but not nearly as lumpy and bumpy as your first work session. Keep an eye on the thickness of the rim. Keep making adjustments. Trying to keep things as consistent as possible at this stage. Thinning those walls out a little bit more if you need to. So a little bit floppy. Gonna flip that upside down again. So this is your end of your second work session. It's still too soft to support its own weight, so flip it upside down. At this point in the process of making your pinch pot, you're probably noticing, as the clay continues to dry, cracks that are forming, especially along the rim, are becoming more challenging to fix. They just kind of keep reappearing. So you will need to take a toothpick, as I'm doing here, and scratching into the surface of the clay. You will scratch across left to right, making fairly deep marks and crossing over each other, like making little X's. And so by roughing that clay up, you will then be dragging the clay particles back and forth over that area where the clay is splitting, and then you need to smooth it back out by using your fingers and a lightly dampened sponge. So keep an eye on those spots. Again, at this point, you got to be really careful with how you're handling your clay. Too much movement or wiggling of the walls will cause cracks to reappear or new ones to form.